November 2019. Gulf St. Vincent, South Australia. 7 million oysters pour from a barge into the water. But a month later, scientists record the following. Larvae are present in the water, a reef is on the seabed, and settlement is almost zero. Why are millions of living organisms ignoring the reef that was built for them? 2 years later, researchers tried something unusual. They played sound underwater. Within the first month, up to 17,000 additional oysters per square meter had settled on certain sections. A gulf that had been silent for 200 years heard a signal and responded. But the strangest part was that the problem turned out to be not the absence of oysters and not the absence of money. The problem was the absence of sound. And that changes everything we thought we knew about restoring marine ecosystems. So how did this happen? In 1836, British ships enter Gulf St. Vincent. Beneath the water lies something they do not yet have a name for, a continuous living carpet several meters thick. Billions of flat Australian oysters, Ostrea ungasi, covering 1,500 kilometers of coastline. The reefs are so dense they are visible from the surface at low tide. Early travelers described them as a hazard to navigation, an obstacle to be avoided. Each oyster here filters over 100 liters of water per day. The reef is at once a nursery for fish, a defense against coastal erosion, and a biological filtration station for the entire Gulf. The whole ecosystem of Gulf St. Vincent rests on these reefs as on a foundation. Without them, the water turns murky, algae spread, and the seabed suffocates. The colonists saw in them food and building material. Shells were burned for lime. Oyster cement built the first houses of the colony. The oysters themselves were eaten, simply, without any regulation, as many as could be taken. The trajectory is straightforward and merciless. In 1836, continuous reefs stretched along the entire coastline. In 1841, commercial dredge harvesting began. Trawl nets moved across the seabed, scraping away everything living again and again, without any oversight and without any pause for recovery. In 1911, the Chief Inspector of Fisheries of South Australia wrote in his report after a long survey of the Gulf, "Where oysters once abounded, almost nothing can now be found, and the reefs are becoming less productive with each passing year." He recommended halting all dredging, but too late. In 1913, all commercially viable reefs were completely exhausted. By the early 2000s, not a single known natural oyster reef remained on the mainland coast of Australia. 75 years from the first ship to total destruction. What had been built over millennia disappeared within the lifetime of 2 generations. Consider Chesapeake Bay, a bay where oysters once filtered all the water in 3 to 4 days, where reefs stood like underwater islands and fishermen navigated by them as landmarks. Today, less than 1% of the historical oyster population remains in Chesapeake. Scientists say it plainly: when 99% of the oysters disappear, 99% of the reef habitat disappears with them, along with 99% of everything that lived within it. The water turns murky. Dead zones expand. Fish productivity collapses. In Gulf St. Vincent, they reached zero. And here it is important to understand something that most people do not grasp. Oyster reefs are sound. A living reef is noisy. Pistol shrimp snap. Fish vibrate and produce sound during spawning. Shell grinds against shell in the current. Crabs move. Mussels pulse. Scientists call this a biogenic soundscape, a functional signal to which other organisms respond. When the reefs disappeared, the Gulf fell silent. And in that silence lay a problem that in 2017 no one yet fully understood. Dominic McAfee is a marine ecologist, accustomed to holding a hydrophone in the cold wind of South Australia, accustomed to field conditions and to data that does not match expectations. He is a researcher whose work is devoted to quantitative models of mollusk population recovery, but he was the first in Australia to ask the question seriously: what if the problem with reef restoration is not physical but acoustic? In 2017, the Nature Conservancy begins building Windara Reef. Windara is a word from the language of the Narunga people, the indigenous inhabitants of this coastline, meaning Eastern York Peninsula. The project is a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, the Government of South Australia, the York Peninsula Council, and the University of Adelaide. 159 limestone bases are laid across 20 hectares of sandy seabed 1 kilometer from shore at a depth of 8 to 10 meters. In 2019, 7 million hatchery-raised oysters are dropped onto these bases. The project goes off-plan from the very first season, for 2 reasons at once. Problem 1. Algae. The moment the limestone bases settle on the seabed, turf algae begin colonizing them. They cover the stone surface in a continuous layer and physically block larval attachment. A larva approaches the reef and simply cannot find anywhere to settle. The surface is taken. McAfee's solution looks strange. He places artificial kelp on the reef bases, made from materials that replicate the structure and flexibility of natural seaweed. The artificial kelp casts shade and mechanically scrubs the surface as it moves with wave action, clearing the turf algae. Live kelp is deliberately not used to avoid drawing down natural forests for the sake of a short-term experiment. It works. The surface is freed, but larvae still do not settle in the required numbers. Problem 2. Silence. This is where McAfee begins thinking about sound in earnest. He has spent several years studying how oyster larvae choose where to attach. It turns out that what was previously considered a passive process, a larva simply carried by the current and settling wherever, is in reality an active choice. Even a microscopic, brainless, earless larva is capable of sensing its environment and moving toward better conditions. In the laboratory, McAfee builds an 8-meter tank. The team jokingly calls it the oyster racetrack, with a speaker at one end. He plays recordings of different underwater environments, sediment flats, seagrass, rocky reefs. The result is unambiguous. Larvae actively swim toward the recording of a living reef. They do not hear sound in any sense we would recognize. They have no ears. But sound waves underwater displace microparticles. These particles stimulate mechanoreceptors on the larva's body, tiny sensory cells on its surface, and the larva follows the vibration gradient back toward its source. It follows the sound, which means it follows the reef. But in Gulf St. Vincent, there is no longer a living reef to produce that signal. Larvae were drifting in absolute acoustic emptiness and finding nothing. But not everyone was convinced, and the skeptics had real arguments drawn from experience. First concern: sound does not discriminate about what it attracts. If it brings in oyster larvae, it brings in everything else as well. Crabs, worms, competing mollusks. There is a risk that a young reef will be colonized by other species before the oysters have time to establish themselves. Second, purely practical. Underwater batteries require replacing every 7 to 10 days. Each replacement means a diver, a boat, time, money. For a single experimental reef, this is manageable. But if we are talking about restoring thousands of kilometers of coastline, the numbers simply do not add up. And third, the deepest objection. To play a recording of a living reef, you first need to find a living reef to record. And in a gulf where no natural reefs remain at all, what do you record? Where do you find the original when the original has been destroyed? 3 logical objections. The skeptics were not wrong about the details. They simply could not see what McAfee was beginning to understand. McAfee records the sound of a living reef at Port Noarlunga Reef, the only rocky reef in Gulf St. Vincent where active bioacoustics have been preserved. 4 hydrophones were distributed across 1.6 kilometers of reef. They record immediately after sunrise, the most acoustically active time of day. Recordings are made across the range of 0.1 to 30 kilohertz, from the lowest vibrations to ultrasound. Then, speakers were placed on Windara Reef and on a second restoration site, Glenelg Reef, located approximately 80 kilometers away on the other side of the Gulf near Adelaide. 10 points across 2 reefs. The speakers are simple and cheap, 25 watts, omnidirectional, frequency range 0.3 to 20 kilohertz, housed in waterproof PVC casings made in-house. They play the living reef recording continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A battery lasts approximately a week, after which a diver descends and replaces it. Running in parallel were control sections without sound. There were 4 conditions: sound only, artificial kelp only, sound plus kelp, and nothing. Every month, divers remove and count larvae on purpose-built settlement plates. Up to 17,000 additional oysters per square meter within the first month alone. At the best points, up to 17,000. Averaged across Windara Reef, around 4,000 per meter. Across Glenelg Reef, around 6,000. At 8 of the 10 sites, sound produced a statistically significant increase in settlement compared to controls. Without sound, a few hundred larvae per meter, or 0. With sound, thousands. The study passed independent peer review and was published in the Journal of Applied Ecology in 2023. Now for the 3 objections from the skeptics. Unwanted species? Yes, sound attracts other reef inhabitants, but this turned out to be an advantage, not a problem. Diversity accelerates reef establishment. A reef is not a monoculture, and the more species settle simultaneously, the more robust and functional the structure becomes overall. Resource intensity? A real problem. But McAfee points to a key moment. The speakers are only needed in the first months, while the reef is building its own acoustic profile. Once there are enough oysters, they themselves begin generating the noise that attracts new arrivals. The system becomes self-sustaining. The speakers are only a starting impulse, not a permanent infrastructure. Where to find sound to record? This is the hardest challenge, and it remains open. Port Noarlunga Reef is the only place in the Gulf with living acoustics. If it too degrades, the sound library disappears with it. This question we return to at the end. Here is what no one anticipated. The goal of the experiment was simple: attract more oyster larvae, accelerate recovery, and fill the reef faster. But when the data came in, it turned out that oysters which had settled under sound were larger. They formed denser three-dimensional structures. On sections with sound, 70% of the boulders showed vertical growth of up to 20 millimeters above the surface. On the controls, only 10% of boulders showed growth, and growth did not exceed 9 millimeters. The reef where sound was playing grew upward. The reef without sound stayed flat. The difference between a flat reef and a three-dimensional one is the difference between a desert and a forest. A flat reef is a carpet. A three-dimensional reef is architecture. Young crabs and fish that need shelter from predators hide between the layers of shells. Crustaceans colonize the cavities between oysters. Sponges and mussels attach to the projections. Each new layer creates new microhabitats, each of which attracts new inhabitants. One species draws another in its wake. Complexity accumulates not linearly but exponentially, and it all begins with the first larva finding somewhere to settle. Each oyster filters over 100 liters of water per day. Millions of oysters are the lungs of the Gulf. Gulf St. Vincent, where nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural runoff had been creating dead zones for years, where algal blooms cut off oxygen from bottom-dwelling organisms, begins to breathe differently. Slowly, but perceptibly. And one more finding, quieter but in the long run more important than anything else. The restoration of a dead reef fails because we are destroying information. A healthy ecosystem is the acoustic memory of a place, the sound that a larva perceives and responds to. When the reef disappears, so does the signal that told the next generation, this is a good place, settle here. Larvae begin drifting in silence without bearings. They exist, the conditions exist, but the navigation is broken. McAfee describes this phenomenon as acoustic landscape degradation. For decades we have spoken about the degradation of physical environments, coral destruction, wetland drainage, forest clearance. We understand the loss of species and genetic diversity, but it turns out that ecosystems also lose their voice. And without that voice, recovery does not begin. Even when everything is physically ready, the money has been spent, and millions of oysters are already in the water. Sound is the infrastructure. The principle discovered in Gulf St. Vincent is already being tested on coral reefs in the Indo-Pacific and on oyster reefs in the United Kingdom. Researchers in different parts of the world are beginning to ask the same question. Has our degraded ecosystem lost its acoustic signal? And is that the reason it is not recovering despite all our efforts? This is a general mechanism we are only beginning to understand. As of 2026, both reefs are functioning. At Glenelg Reef, 14 bases near Adelaide, 2.5 years after construction, biodiversity recovery has been recorded at 60% of the level of a healthy reference reef. Windara Reef, 20 hectares and 159 bases on York Peninsula, is developing more slowly due to more challenging conditions, but is also showing a stable trajectory. The reef is attracting commercially important fish species, King George whiting and snapper. It is open for recreational fishing. Local communities can see the change. The speakers are no longer playing. The reef itself now produces enough sound to attract new inhabitants. But here is the question that remains open. Windara Reef is one reef. Well-funded, well-documented, close to a university and a team of researchers monitoring every square meter. But Gulf St. Vincent is 1,500 kilometers of coastline where reefs once stood. The resources to restore even 10% of that do not exist in Australia or anywhere else. And there is one more problem that has not gone away. Port Noarlunga Reef, where McAfee made his living sound recordings, is the only place in Gulf St. Vincent with living acoustics. It exists, but it is under constant pressure. Urbanization, climate change, rising water temperatures, ocean acidification. If it degrades, the sound library disappears with it. There will be nothing left to record, nothing from which to restore acoustically. We have learned to store plant seeds in vaults against catastrophe. We have learned to freeze the genetic material of animals, but no one is systematically recording and preserving the sounds of disappearing ecosystems as an archive, as an insurance policy, as material for future restoration. How many ecosystems in the world have already lost their voice, and we do not yet know it, because we never thought of sound as a resource that could disappear forever?